Hi, it's Jim Lindeman again, and we are going to go with the fifth session, which is about fossils. And this is kind of one I have kind of a lot of fun with, because in many respects I kind of expect that people's minds will get blown by some of the stuff that we're talking about and showing on this one. It's going to be a long one, and so we'll have to see how long it takes. So, fossils. Jurassic Park, Part 2. We found human DNA in a 16 billion year old mosquito, cloned it, and we ended up with Red Flintstone. We're all brothers under the skin. Did you know that, Nasty? Deep down inside, you're just like me. I didn't come here to be insulted. Okay, anyway, index fossils. Dating of rock. It's not by appearance of age, it's not by stone content, it's not by mineral content, it's not by structural features, it's not by adjacent rocks, because sometimes you'll have older on top of younger rather than the other way around. Not by radioisotope dating, not by total fossil content. Some fossils are alive even today. But by index fossils, that they were assumed to be in a certain position in the evolutionary scale, assumed to be of limited duration, and therefore the age of any stone is determined by the fossil. The fossil is determined by evolutionary presupposition. It must be whatever. And a saying that I kind of like, faith is the substance of fossils hoped for, the evidence of links unseen. Too much of evolution is based upon that faith creed. Okay, so you have here the coelacanth, an ancient, almost legendary stump-legged fish, beginning 390 million years ago, extinct since 65 million years. Apparently the evolutionary beginnings of limbs. It is an index fossil, or was an index fossil. As you can see, there's the fins have kind of an arm-like appendage. That was until they started to pull up live coelacanths from deep sea, 100 to 500 meters in depth. In other words, what they said was supposed to be extinct for 65 million years is still alive. It's called a Lazarus taxion, an evolutionary line that seems to disappear from the fossil record and reappears much later. Now, the thing that gets me is that the human mutation rate is that with each birth, there are 60 differences from the parents. Now you're dealing with thousands and millions of different characteristics to the human, and so 60 isn't really that enormous. But the thing is that if you're going to have how many generations in 65 million years, to suddenly turn around and say, evolution turned off. Evolution really didn't do anything for 65 million years. During that time, you have all kinds of animals that came and went. But you cannot challenge the status quo concepts. You cannot say is that maybe there's something wrong with the way that you have identified what lived when. Where did you get that from? So you have the Lazarus taxion, the index fossil that suddenly lost its place because they're still around and they have not really changed dramatically from what they were back then. Okay, let's just consider something here. Let's take a look at what dinosaurs and talk about some of the dinosaurs. Jose Diaz-Balio, a Mexican archaeologist journalist responsible for the discovery, says there's evidence that the serpent bird sculpture located in the ruins of Tajín is not merely the product of main flights of fancy, but a realistic representation of an animal that lived during the period of the ancient Mayan 1,000 to 5,000 years ago. Animals with such characteristics are believed to have disappeared 130 million years ago. And so we're going to take a look at the serpent bird of the Mayans, or Quetzalcoatl. So here you have the heads. Again, very, very, very much detailed. Again, the head. You notice out of the mouth is this square hole, and you kind of wonder, well, why is that there? And then you have the representation of whatever this beast is, serpent. And I'm just going to draw your attention to this and ask you, what do you think is this? It's not like a serpent has the split tongue, but the split tongue doesn't curl around like that. So what would this be representing that it would come out in that kind of a shape, stylized shape? So as you take a look at it, one thing to realize is that the depictions of humans are very accurate, very, very lifelike. And so you wonder, well, then what about this? Is it just merely stylized? Or is there actually something that would have a similar look to it? Look more, and this serpent bird has teeth, has eyes set forward, seems to have an ear area, something that's behind it there. Now, you take a look at what Herodias said. There's a place in Arabia situated very near the city of Buto, to which I went on hearing of some winged serpents. And when I arrived there, I saw bones and spines of serpents in such quantities as it would be impossible to describe. The form of the serpent is like that of a water snake, but he has wings without feathers, and as like as possible to the wings of a bat. His third volume tells how these animals were found in Arabian spice groves. He describes their size, coloration, and reproduction, and were infamous for hanging in the frankincense trees, which they would have to smoke out in order to be able to harvest the frankincense from those trees. So you do have accounts of winged serpents. And so maybe what the Aztecs saw is not a fantasy, but something that is real. And then you have an apparent petrosaur in Green River, Utah. So in other words, in the rock you have the rock draw shape, and you have something that's long-legged, long-winged, that looks like a large bird, but you wonder, well, what is it that we don't have any idea what they saw when they drew this. Okay, dragons. Where did dragons come from? The Order of the Dragon was created to defend Europe against invading Ottoman Turks in the 15th century, 1400s. Chinese have a tradition of a dragon. The Greeks and the Romans have the chimera. The medieval and early Europeans had dragons and sea monsters, often reflecting what dinosaurs might look like. But this was long before the relatively modern science of paleontology had discovered, assembled, and fleshed out in dinosaur bones. Where did such pictures and legends come from? So what did they use as the basis for this kind of an idea if they never saw anything like it? Oops. Oh, let's get back here. All right. So you have, again, 1400. So you have this idea of a winged animal. You have the dragon on Longshan temple. Again, kind of like a serpent with spines. Now, this is in the book of, near Flagstaff, Arizona. Did the Anastasi artist just have a wild imagination, or did he see something that we don't see in our world today? And this is another picture of that. What's coming out of his mouth? What is he trying to identify about this animal? Isaiah 14, the King James Version, has a fiery flying serpent. Flying serpent is in the RSV, New International Version, the darting serpent. The same as the fiery serpents of Numbers 21. The Hebrew is seraph, for which describes a particular class of angels, the seraphim. What's being talked about there? What was experienced by humans back then, at that time and place? You have the Leviathan. Job 41 describes the Leviathan. One commentary says that this is a crocodile. But what crocodile can be described as? His snorting throws out flashes of light. His eyes are like the rays of dawn. Firebrands stream from his mouth. Sparks of fire shoot out. Smoke pours from his nostrils as if from a boiling pot, hot over a fire of reeds. His breath sets coals ablaze and flames dart from his mouth. The sword that reaches him has no effect, nor does the spear or the dart or the javelin. The old mythical dragon. But would God use a non-existent creature in talking about his own creative ability? God using a fake creature to prove his almighty power and wisdom would make it nonsense, even to the believer. So you have this description here. Now you can say, well, it's just flights of fantasy. It's just, that whoever wrote Job, obviously it wouldn't be God, was just going off and talking about something that did not exist. But then why would you even have the idea? Where would it come from? What was observed to give you the idea that this, even in fantasy, could exist? Genesis 1:21 says that God created the great creatures of the sea. A commentary notes the Hebrew word underlying this phrase was used in Canaanite mythology to name a dreaded sea monster. Isaiah 27, the gliding serpent, the coiling or twisting serpent, the monster, dragon of the sea. The crocodile is not a creature of the sea, but of a marsh. So where is this coming from? Where is these descriptions coming from? And why are they being talked about in areas that really do not apply to what we know today? Go back to this now. What's coming out of his mouth? We have evidence, human observation, that talks about the possibility that there really was flame-throwing animals. Whether you want to like it or not, whether you want to try and diss it or not. Where did the tradition come from? And what is this that's being represented by these curled figures? Why is this a square hole? Did they stick something in there that was flaming? Or did they have it connected to a series of tubes out of which smoke would come to help give effect? I don't know. I don't know. Why? Why is it that way? You have the Babylonian chaos monster. Here's a monster that looks like an animal, but he's got feathers, he's got wings, and everything else like that. Now, you have to ask, are multi-species attributes merely fantasy? Do you have feathers on something that looks like a lion? Can that be? Is that real? Or is that just a fantasy? Well, you have the old platypus. The platypus genome sequence, published in Nature in 2008, reveals both reptilian and mammalian elements in the genome, as well as two genes found previously only in birds, amphibians, and fish. In other words, yeah, you do. have animals that have mixes. Now, in terms of evolution, you got some real problems trying to figure out how did you put these together, or how did evolution put these together. On the other hand, if you have a creator who's just having fun in his creation, and he's coming up with all kinds of different ideas, then these things aren't necessarily plagues of fantasy. And you do have records. Now you can just simply toss the records aside, or you can ask the question of where did it come from? Why would they even conceive of it? How and why did this evolve? How did the platypus evolve? Behemoth. Behold the behemoth which I made along with you. He eats grass like an ox. His strength is in his hips. His power is in the stomach muscles. He moves his tail like a cedar. The sinews of his thighs are tightly knit. His bones are like beams of bronze. His ribs like bars of iron. He is the first of the ways of God. Only he who made him can bring near his sword. Surely the mountains yield food for him. He lies under the lotus trees in a covert of reeds and marsh. The lotus trees cover him with their shade. The willows by the brook surround him. Indeed, the river may rage, yet he is not disturbed. He is confident, though the Jordan gushes into his mouth. Can one take him with hooks, or pierce his nose with a snare? Well, this was talked about as a hippopotamus. But again, you have description here, like his tail is like a cedar. Have you seen the tail of a hippopotamus? That takes really a wilder imagination to try and match that than some of the other stuff that we have seen represented. Two U.S. scientists believe the mysterious elephant-sized animal with a long neck and tail seen in the swampy jungles of West Equatorial Africa may be a dinosaur. When shown pictures of living animals, the natives identified them correctly. Then they pointed to a picture of Brontosaurus to identify what they called a mokele-mbembe. One such creature was killed in 1959 because it disturbed lake fishing. The creatures like to concentrate near jungle rivers and lakes in the Congo and Zaire. They are 30 feet from head to tail, having clawed feet, are air-breathing, amphibious, live in lakes and rivers, often feeding the shore at night. This was in the 1980. Clicking. Bishop Bell's tomb. Long tail, long neck, very much the idea of a dinosaur. Very much the idea of dragons, very often that are depicted in the medieval world. This was from the 1400s, right, just before the change of the century. And that's what he has of his. Now, this is just Flights of Frenzy, or of Fantasy, rather. Angkor Wat, Top Rome Temple, 9th century. So what is that? As you take a look at it, what is it? Well, Stegosaurus. And you have here what seems to be almost plesiosaur, or that kind of a type of animal. Where would they have seen that if the only evidence that they existed were in bones that they have never dug up? Where then would that idea ever occur to them? These 2,500-year-old ceramic-fired figurines were discovered at the foot of El Toro Mountain on the outskirts of Acambaro, Mexico. Now, again, you have very similar types of animals that we would describe as dinosaurs. This one is perhaps a little bit more flight of fantasy, I realize. But still, these shapes and the types of way that they express how the animal lived and looked like. And also something that's very, very special. Here you have again, in Lima, Peru, you have a bunch of figures that were found back 50, 60 years ago. Something, again, that's very, very important is as you take a look at this animal with something coming out of its mouth that has a back of what are called median dermal spines. The thing about it is that they were unknown until 1992. So you figure about 23 years ago, 25 years ago, if you will, these were not known. So when these were found and they were accused of being made fakes, where did the idea of these kinds of spines come from when nobody knew they existed until 25 years ago? The same thing here. You have spines all over the place. And yet, if you look at any dinosaur pictures prior to 1992, they're all smoothed back because nobody knew about these median dermal spines. Where did they get the idea? Unless they saw them. In other words, dinosaurs still were around and really not that ancient of a time. And again, you have a piece of pottery here. And again, you have this pottery, which is, I don't know what the age of it is, but it's at the Larco Museum. And you have the spines visible. Nobody knew until 25 years ago in our scientific minds. These existed, but the ancients did. The ancients put it into their pictures, into their pottery, to other things. Well, you have Nessie. There are sightings all over the world in regard to a Loch Ness type and 5 other major types of monsters, again of animals that appear similar to dinosaurs. Some of these sightings and descriptions came long before paleontology came on the scene. But all this is rejected with a snicker because it doesn't conform to evolution's conclusions, and therefore must be merely superstition. Really? University of Arizona scientists say that a 1978 picture of an American Loch Ness monster in a Vermont lake was not faked, but they aren't sure just what the creature is. It looks like a dinosaur having flippers in place of legs. 8 feet of neck stick out of the water. So, what is it? But of course, dinosaurs don't exist because they died out 65 million years ago. And therefore, we don't know what this is. Think again of the coelacanth, who were dismissed as having died 64 million years ago. And all of a sudden, they're still around. Maybe the dating of these things is wrong. New Jersey pine barrens, over 1 million acres of pines and oaks in a sea of sandy soil. For over 200 years now, these eerie acres have been the hunting ground of the creature known as the Jersey Devil. We've talked to too many credible eyewitnesses, policemen, forest rangers, government officials to write this thing off as a hoax, says McCloy. Whatever it is, it scared these people. A story from the records of the Smithsonian that the Ponca Indians who lived in the vicinity of Yankton, South Dakota, killed a mastodon as late as 1700 near Niobrara, Nebraska. According to evolution, mastodons should have been extinct millions of years ago. They also killed a giant sloth. They called the mastodon Pasnuta, which in Ponca means long nose. All right? So you decide. Is what evolution has decided has to be in terms of the ancient animals, the supposedly ancient animals, true? Or is it that maybe they were and are still around, or maybe they've died off now, but have been still around even into modern times? The real reason for the demise of the dinosaurs, Hagar the Horrible, sign of the dragon or whatever sniffs Hagar, gets sick to his stomach and runs off. Hagar says, and people wonder why I don't take more baths. Well, that's probably what happened. Mount St. Helens. Very fascinating and very, very wonderful occurrence was the explosion of Mount St. Helens in terms of scientific research. The ash from the cloud collapse was deposited in layers which would have been assumed to take many centuries. And as you take a look at this picture, you have everything. You have striations and everything else like that, that if you came upon this scene without having any knowledge of what happened, you would think that, oh, well, these things were laid down over millions of years. This was all formed in one day. Notice the size of the person here. This is a huge, huge wall of ash. And it sure looks like it took millions of years, and it didn't. In other words, things that are told you that would take millions and millions of years in order to happen don't have to. Oops. Oh, come on. Okay, trees in the log mat were being buried with root ball downward as if it were a forest buried in situ. When the explosion happened, the explosion just rolled over the hills that were in front of the explosion and literally blasted the bark off of them, and many of them were just blown out of the earth. And they all came down into a big mat in Spirit Lake. And what was found was that the trees were settling, root ball down, and because of the collapse of ash and all the other stuff that was coming down, they were being buried as if they were a forest standing. And yet, no, all of this happened, creating that, and literally within weeks, within the first couple of years, you have the makings of a petrified forest that looks like it's still standing and yet has been affected very powerfully by the explosion. The bark and twigs formed a thick peat bog echoing the structure of many coal deposits, such as at Chicago. Peat bogs in southern Ontario were developed in 150 years, when the accepted theory was that bogs are ancient, thousands of years old. Millions of years to lay sediment to form rock, then cut deep canyons in that rock. Yet 600 feet of layered sediment in 4 years, 25 feet in one day, 140-foot deep canyon, 1/40th the size of and similar to the Grand Canyon, was formed in one day. And you have this tiny little stream going down as you have the Colorado River in the midst of the huge Grand Canyon, this tiny, tiny river in comparison. And so we take a look at this and say, now hold it. What you have in the Grand Canyon does not take millions of years. So you have here, there's the last direction, the Pumice Plain, the St. Helens Lake, Spirit Lake is here, and all the rest. The process assumed to take millions of years take place within a decade. This was only a single geographical event. Imagine the combined geological effect at the time of the flood. where apparently there was a lot of volcanic activity as the Earth's crust broke free, broke loose, and what was underneath came up. Fossil footprints. Okay, so what do you see in this? What do you see? Well, you see dinosaur tracks. You also see a footprint. But notice something about that footprint. It's got toes, and the toes are very articulated. Now, I'm not sure where the other footprint is or anything else, but the thing is that something's pretty obvious there. Question I ask people, how long does it take to make a fossil footprint? Most people will say maybe thousands of years or whatever else. And the answer is, before the next rain. Before the next heavy rain can wash it all out. It's made in mud. So you have to realize is that the mud can become mud again very easily and lose that fine definition. You have an example of this here. In 1976, famed anthropologist Mary Leakey discovered 70 human footprints in stone in Tanzania, known as the Laetoli tracks. Leakey felt that they looked like modern human footprints, but the stratum was dated at 3.6 million years. No modern human was around yet, according to evolution. But you can see here, where you have rain leaving little craters. And you can see where it's kind of modified the footprints, even though the footprints are still there. You have as the person is running, or whatever the person's doing, that you have the buildup of the mud behind the toes. This is where you have, okay, the idea of what happens when it rains, at least on the footprints. And yet something turned that to stone before you had any kind of a heavy rainfall again. That's one reason why you don't have many of fossils, especially fossil footprints, happening now. Because why? Whatever the conditions were to take mud and turn it to stone before the next rain do not occur now. One of the things that you notice is that as you take a look at what was mud, even here, deep enough to take a print, yet not to struggle. All right? Not at a watering hole where you have so many footprints that you can't distinguish any. No heavy rain, no dry cracks. Now anybody who's been on the farm knows, if you have other land where you've got some land showing, but especially on the farm, if you have a drought, that you have the earth just really cracks and fissures and everything else like that. You have none of that here. Whatever turned this into stone had to happen before rain could even possibly affect it. And it wasn't a long-term type of drying process. You have no wind erosion. Although stone, many tracks are disappearing from weathering already. So in other words, once these things begin to be surfaced, even though they're still stone, they weather very rapidly. So something not only had to make the mud into stone, but then had to cover it so rapidly so that weathering would not affect the imprints. You're talking about something that had to happen very quickly. The Biloxi River footprint. Well, you have one here is the Alvis Delk footprint. You take a look at, this is pretty articulate. And what's interesting is that with the dinosaur imprint, it pushes up the mud around here so that you know that this came first and then that came on top of it. So you have the modern footprint that's represented here at the time of a dinosaur. Now comes a sad thing. Okay, you go to Bible.ca, and it has this whole story about this. They lifted up a whole bunch of overburden. And in it, you had dinosaur tracks and you had human footprints. Now, take a look at this. You have what seems to be, very obviously, a footprint. But you notice, this is the footprint of the dinosaur. The human footprint is not on top of, in the sense. Okay, back up a little bit. One of the questions, or one of the criticisms of the Biloxi River footprints is that every human footprint weathers and weathers into a dinosaur print. The question is that, well, if the humans went on the dinosaur prints in order to find good firm footing, yeah, you're going to have that. Here is one, at least, in which the footprint, okay, go back. Okay. You notice that the footprint is not directly on top of the dinosaur print. It's just off to the side. And there's the foot, and there's now the dinosaur footprint going down there. The guy that discovered this had a presentation a few days after. There were some evolutionists there who had been just ridiculing the idea of these footprints and making all kinds of one had written a book showing how fake this is all. When he showed this to them, 3 days later, this evolutionist and his friend were seen in the river with iron bars. About a week later, when they went back to take a look at the print, this is what happened. It had been utterly, even the dinosaur print, it had been ruined. This is what happens. And they were witnessed, they were named by witnesses, but this is what can happen when you have people who believe in a certain faith structure, which evolution is, the degree to which they will go in order to maintain their faith. Fast fossils. Looks like an ordinary piece of stone, rounded, smooth, with millions of years, but turn it over and it has the bottom of a modern toy car. You have pliers that have accretion all over it. The close-ups of water wheels show remarkable concretions formed in little more than 60 years. Natural formation whose ages are not known may seem to behave as though they've taken thousands and even millions of years to form. Evolutionary doctrine has left most people with the false idea that what is old really is in the natural, that of the idea that this is old because of look at what's there. You have a gear wheel encased in rock. The wheel is man-made, but the rock is not. Natural formed rock containing shells and part of differential casing. Fossilization does not need vast periods of time. You have a hammer that's encased in rock. And what's been interesting about this is that this is not something that was put in there, because the iron is very uncharacteristic of what is made today. The composition of the chlorine sulfur, no carbon, iron, chlorine, sulfur, no carbon, density tests indicate exceptional casting quality. Where did it come from? How did it get to be in rock? Where did it come from? Because this was not what has been out, but the way that iron has been smelted in our day and age. You have a fossil hat. It's a hat that was, there's a waterfall, you put anything in there and it turns to stone. If you leave it in there, and it becomes just like dinosaur bones. But this happens literally within weeks. You have here, it is commonly believed that petrification is a process taking millions of years. Not true. Under ideal conditions, petrification can take place in as few as 3 weeks. You are looking at parts of petrified flour sacks from the Blue Spring, and Spring Mill rather. Note the stitching at the end of the sack as you get to it down there. And it's stone. And it happened in, 3 weeks? It doesn't take millions of years for something like this to happen. It just takes the right conditions. But these cannot be fossils. You know why? You know why these aren't fossils? Because the definition of fossil by the American Geological Institute begins, the remains or traces of animals or plants which have been preserved by natural causes in the Earth's crust. There is nothing in this definition that requires transformation into rock. All that is important is that the fossil has been preserved. And again, the remains or traces of animals or plants which have been preserved by natural causes in the Earth's crust, exclusive of organisms which have been buried since the beginning of historic time. In other words, anything that has been part of our historical time, when man has recorded history, anything that happens cannot be a fossil because it has been defined out of existence. A remnant or trace of an organism of a past geological age, such as a skeleton or leaf imprint, embedded and preserved in the Earth's crust. Therefore, fast fossils are not fossils. They're only accretions, despite how the process has identical results to what is claimed to take millions of years. What you have is a laboratory experience of saying, no, this stuff can happen very, very rapidly under natural conditions. But it is excluded from being considered because they have been defined as not bearing on the idea of fossils. Remember, theory determines data. Way back in the first session, determines what will be explained away. Non-fossil fossils. Well, okay, so now what do we have here? At the Museum of the Rockies, Montana, all bones are in excellent preservation, but show little sign of petrification. They are pure bone, thought to be 65 million years old. So here you have something that looks like it just was killed not that long ago, still preserved as bone, but it's a fossil because according to evolution, they had to have lived 65 million years ago, therefore they are defined as fossils. Northwest Alaska, 1961, discovery of a large half-meter thick bone bed. In other words, you're looking at bones that are up to your knee, thereabouts. Assumed to be recent bison bones. The guy that came across it just thought they were from a recent bison kill. It took 20 years for scientists to recognize the bones of a duck-billed dinosaur, horned dinosaurs, large and small carnivorous dinosaurs. They weren't preserved by cold, since the area at that time when these supposedly animals lived was semi-tropical, and the earth was warmer. 65 million years exposed, not turned into stone, and still available as bone. Byron C. Nelson describes the vast area from Europe through Siberia to Alaska loaded with millions of mammoth remains so packed that some Siberian islands seem made up entirely of mammoth bones. Processes too modern and too rapid are discounted, yet no processes are considered extremely ancient. To what shall I compare this generation? It is like children in the marketplaces, calling to their playmates. We piped for you, and you did not dance. We wailed, and you did not mourn. When it comes to phenomena, theory determines data, and data will never contradict theory. Fossil accretion conundrums. Captain Lacey's strip coal mine near Hammondsville, Ohio, workman James Parsons loosened a huge mass of coal which fell into the pit 100 feet below the surface, revealing a large smooth slate wall which was literally covered with hieroglyphics in lines about 3 inches apart. Crowds flocked to see this marvel. Local scholars could not read the hieroglyphics. In 1886, near Layton, Kentucky, a massive, well-dressed stone wall was unearthed by workmen quarrying rock. Under about 10 feet of drift and 20 feet of rock and at least 40 feet in, it was firmly embedded in a solid limestone quarry, which certainly was formed around it since the wall was built. Now remember, if it happens in historic time, it cannot be a fossil. And yet, you have this solid limestone, which is supposedly goes way, way, way back to earliest times. About January 1st, 1927, near Fisher Canyon in Pershing County, Nevada, Albert E. Knapp found a fossilized imprint of a shoe sole in limestone. A geologist of New York's Rockefeller Foundation verified as Triassic limestone, 160 to 195 million years old. Microphotographs show very distinctly the imprint that was of a well-made piece of leather stitched by hand. At one place, the thread, smaller than that used by shoemakers today, was double-stitched in something that was 160 to 195, something that well-made way back then. Now, is this a fossil? Or is this because it was in this 160 to 195 million year old limestone bed? Or was this an accretion? It couldn't be that old, so it had to be something where the limestone formed around it. And this is where the definition begins to fall apart, but it will never be admitted. This here, Meeting House Hill, Dorchester, Massachusetts. A metallic vase was blasted out of an immense mass of solid Precambrian rock, over 600 million years old. Made of an unknown metal, the artifact was beautifully inlaid with pure silver. It portrayed 6 figures of a flower, a bouquet, a vine, or wreath. The chasing, carving, and inlaying were cleverly and exquisitely done. So, is this a fossil from prehistoric time because it's 65 million year old rock? Or was the rock an accretion because this is from historic times? Now, this is the thing, is that you don't hear about these kinds of things. And the question that I have is what my pre-flood people have been capable of. You think of, you have people that living maybe about 800 to 1,000 years. Methuselah was 969. If you had somebody that had the creativity, say, for instance, Alexander Graham Bell, or any of the other famous inventors, and they lived 900 years, how much do you think that pre-flood people would be able to have come up with amazing types of inventions? What were they capable of? What did they end up doing? Gems from coal. Okay, so you have 1812, Thomas, Oklahoma, municipal electric plant fireman Frank Split a large piece of coal from the Wilburton, Oklahoma mines and discovered an iron pot embedded inside. The pot is on display at the Miles Musical Museum, Eureka Springs. American Journal of Science. Now realize that these are journals. These are the top things of which science identifies its major discoveries. An iron thimble was found in a coal seam 7 million years old. Pennsylvania, a spoon was found inside of coal. Pennsylvania, November 1829, quarry northwest of Philadelphia, 70 feet below ground, a marble block was found with what appeared to be a 1 and a U carved into it. Generally, such finds are rarely publicized today. How likely is it that we have run out of such anomalies? Really? We're not finding any more? How probable is it that the news of such discoveries is suppressed? Squishy tissue. Fascinating thing. Situation is that there was a find of I think a Tyrannosaurus Rex or that kind of an animal. And it was found in the wall of a canyon. And so a paleontologist went and he and his team isolated the bones. But they had a problem because the thigh bone was so big that even a helicopter couldn't lift it from the side of the cliff. And so they had to break the thigh bone. And the paleontologist took some of the stuff, some of the items, especially from around the marrow, and he sent it to his friend Mary Schweitzer. And Mary was bathing some of these fragments in a weak acid solution to help remove the stone, the limestone that was around it, and accidentally left it too long. And so it removed whatever the bone would have been. And what she came upon was you had blood vessels. You had blood cells that were very visible, that could be squished out from the blood vessels. You had the dendrite character of bone, of bone connective tissue. You had here a piece of ligament or whatever that was still very pliable. There was an interview that they had on TV, and on TV you could see where it was pulled apart, let go, and it would snap back. And you could do this a number of times, and it didn't make this ligament break. It was still quite pliable. You have other kinds of things, the fresh appearance that made it hard to believe that this was millions of years old. You have all of this other fiber structure that indicates something fairly recent. Because protein, even in sealed containers, breaks down. At best may last tens of thousands of years, but not 65 million. And so you have something like this that emphasizes the fact that these aren't really that old. The mastodon, woolly mammoth rather, huge with appetite to match, not carnivorous, an herbivore. The Berescova mammoth, fresh, frozen flesh so fresh as though the animal had recently died. Well-preserved food fragments in the mouth and between the teeth. Unchewed bead pods in the mouth suggest an instant death. In other words, these didn't die a slow death where the weather started to change and whether it got colder and colder and colder. These were temperate zone animals. The food in their mouth was temperate zone, which is pretty much like around us. And it wasn't as if suddenly things got colder and colder and colder and colder and they ran out of food and they died. It's that he was in the middle of eating something and died like that. and was frozen, flash frozen enough that the meat was still edible. Foot and stomach preserved well enough to categorize the vegetation by species. Also several rhinoceroses, some remarkably preserved, other fleshy remnants from a horse or young musk ox, wolverine, wolves, squirrels, bison, rabbit, a lynx. Flash frozen, Hertz wrote in his diary that the Berescova mammoth looks as fresh as well-frozen beef or horse meat. It looked so appetizing that we wondered for some time whether we should not taste it, but no one would venture to take it into his mouth. The dogs cleaned up whatever mammoth meat was thrown to them. To preserve meat in apparently this size, apparently edible condition, the body temperature must be dropped to -5 Celsius within 32 to 48 hours after death, then immediately dropped to -70. Environmental temperature of -101 Celsius or below would have been required. So in other words, it went from temperate zone, it went from eating, in the midst of eating, it went to death like that, and then flash frozen, the temperature went down to a -101 centigrade to preserve it. The thing is that ever since then, it was never thawed. It was not refrozen meat or frozen and refrozen multiple times. Once it was frozen, once it was encased, it never was thawed again until now. Frozen, standing up. Wasn't even lying down. It wasn't didn't die, fall over. It was frozen like that. From 10 degrees centigrade, 50 plants were in maturity to a -100 blast freezer, literally before the next chew. Then never to return to above freezing temperatures. Well, Manuel Velikovsky, which we could talk an awful lot about, has a theory that is very, very, I think, very realistic and very real, very possible. Things can happen with dramatic speed on this earth. But after the long ages confirmed by radiometric dating, well, we'll have to talk about that next time, because radiometric dating has some real problems. But here you have God's wishes, all them, no rim. Take a look at the fossils, and the fossils present a whole different story than what is normally allowed them to say. Okay, so this week, Science versus Evolution. There's no reading from this source. Read these 2 short online articles. Evaluate them. Next week, there's 108 pages. Read the fossils in strata. 2 more online articles about fossils. Choose a useful focus from today's presentation and next week's reading to be able to identify how would you talk about this to somebody that you knew or you came across. Thank you. Next time we talk about dating, but not between a man and a woman. The dating that is used to determine how long things supposedly existed. See you then.